The afternoon sun beat down on Westridge High School as the final bell rang. Students poured out of the building, eager to start their weekend. Among them was 16-year-old Amara Johnson, who kept her head down as she walked through the crowded hallway. She had only been at this school for 3 weeks since her family moved from across the country, and she was still finding her way. Amara was different from many of the students at Westridge. In her old neighborhood, she had been part of a community where diversity was celebrated. But here, in this predominantly white suburban school, she often felt like an outsider. "Just get to the bus," she whispered to herself as she clutched her backpack straps tightly. Amara had been avoiding trouble since day one, even though she noticed the stares and whispers when she walked into a classroom. What nobody at Westridge knew was that Amara had a secret. Back in her old city, her parents had enrolled her in martial arts training when she was just 7 years old. Her father, a former military man, had insisted his daughter know how to defend herself. For the past 9 years, Amara had trained diligently in mixed martial arts, earning her black belt last year. She had even competed in regional tournaments, bringing home several trophies that now sat in boxes, still unpacked in their new home. But at Westridge, Amara kept this part of herself hidden. She wasn't looking for trouble or attention. She just wanted to finish high school, get good grades, and follow her dream of studying engineering in college. As Amara approached her locker, she noticed a group of students huddled nearby. They were known around school as the Ridge Runners, a group of seniors who ruled Westridge with intimidation and fear. Their leader was Blake Thompson, the son of a wealthy local businessman and star of the school's wrestling team. Amara kept her eyes forward, hoping to remain invisible, but as she opened her locker, she heard footsteps approaching. "Well, look who it is," came a voice from behind her. "The new girl." Amara took a deep breath, reminding herself what her sensei always taught her: the first victory is choosing not to fight. She turned around to see Blake and his 4 friends surrounding her. Their posture was threatening, with arms crossed and smirks on their faces. "Excuse me," Amara said politely, trying to step around them. "I need to catch my bus." Blake moved to block her path. "What's the rush? We just want to welcome you properly to Westridge." The false friendliness in his voice couldn't mask the underlying hostility. "Thanks, but I've been here 3 weeks already," Amara replied evenly. "And my bus is leaving." One of the girls in the group, Heather, stepped forward. "You know, there are certain ways things work around here. Certain places where certain people belong." The implication was clear, and Amara felt her heart rate increasing. But years of training had taught her to control her breathing, to stay calm under pressure. "I'm just trying to get my education like everyone else," Amara said, keeping her voice steady. Blake leaned against the locker next to hers, getting uncomfortably close. "See, that's the problem. You don't understand. This is our school. We decide who fits in." The hallway had emptied now, most students already gone for the weekend. A teacher passed by at the far end but didn't notice the confrontation brewing by the lockers. "I don't want any trouble," Amara said, closing her locker. Her bus would be leaving in minutes, and missing it would mean a long walk home. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before coming to our school," said another boy from the group, knocking Amara's binder from her hands. Papers scattered across the floor. As Amara bent down to gather her notes, someone kicked the papers further down the hall, sending them sliding across the polished floor. She felt the familiar sensation of energy coursing through her body, the same feeling she got before a tournament match. Her muscles tensed, ready to respond. But she remembered her father's words: "Your training is for protection, never for provocation." "Please stop," Amara said firmly as she stood up. "This isn't necessary." Blake stepped closer, invading her personal space. "What are you going to do about it? Run home crying to mommy?" The group laughed, their voices echoing in the empty hallway. Amara took another deep breath. She was outnumbered 5-1, but that didn't worry her. What worried her was the promise she had made to her parents when they moved: no trouble at the new school. Her dad had been clear: a fresh start means leaving old problems behind. But as Blake reached for her backpack, Amara's instincts kicked in. She took a step back, assuming a subtle defensive stance that would be recognizable only to someone trained in martial arts. "Don't touch my things," she warned, her voice lower now. Something in her tone made Blake pause for just a moment. He glanced at his friends, seeking reassurance, before turning back to Amara with renewed confidence. "Or what?" he challenged, reaching for her backpack again. The Ridge Runners had picked on many students before, exploiting weaknesses and insecurities. They expected tears, pleading, or retreat. What they didn't expect was the composed, steady gaze that Amara fixed on them. "Last warning," Amara said quietly. "Let me get to my bus." Blake laughed and looked at his friends. "Did you hear that? She's giving us a warning." The group closed in tighter around Amara, unaware that they were cornering someone who had spent thousands of hours learning exactly how to handle situations like this. From down the hall came the voice of Mr. Patterson, the history teacher. "Is everything okay over there?" Blake stepped back slightly but kept his intimidating stance. "This isn't over," he whispered to Amara. "Monday morning, behind the gym. We'll teach you where you belong." The group dispersed as Mr. Patterson approached, each giving Amara a threatening look as they walked away. "Everything all right, Ms. Johnson?" the teacher asked, looking concerned. "Yes, sir," Amara replied, picking up the last of her scattered papers. "Just dropped my things." As she hurried outside, she saw her bus pulling away from the curb. She'd have to walk home now, giving her plenty of time to think about what had just happened and what might come on Monday morning. Amara pulled out her phone and started a text to her parents, then stopped. Telling them would only cause worry, and they might contact the school, which would make everything worse. No, she would handle this herself. As she began the long walk home, Amara reflected on the choices ahead of her. She had spent years learning to defend herself, but she had also learned when to use those skills and when to find another way. The weekend stretched before her, 2 days to decide how to respond to Blake's challenge. 2 days to prepare for whatever might come on Monday morning behind the gym. What the Ridge Runners didn't know, what no one at Westridge High knew, was that they hadn't threatened an ordinary new student. They had just picked a fight with someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire life. The walk home gave Amara time to clear her head. By the time she reached the small rental house her family had moved into, she had almost convinced herself that the Ridge Runners were all talk. Maybe they wouldn't show up on Monday. Maybe they'd forget about her over the weekend. As she turned the key in the front door, she could hear her mother singing along to the radio in the kitchen. The familiar sound brought comfort after the stress of the confrontation. "That you, Amara?" her mother called out. Delia Johnson worked as a nurse at the local hospital, often taking night shifts. Having her home in the afternoon was a rare treat. "Yeah, Mom. It's me," Amara replied, dropping her backpack by the door and following the smell of her mother's famous jollof rice. "You're late," Delia noted, stirring the pot on the stove. "Missed the bus?" Amara hesitated. Her mother had a sixth sense for detecting when something was wrong. "Yeah, got held up talking to a teacher." Delia raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "Your father called. He's working late again, trying to impress the new boss." Amara's father had taken a job as a security consultant at a firm across town. The position had prompted their move, and though the pay was better, the hours were longer. "How was school today?" Delia asked, setting a plate of food in front of her daughter. "Fine," Amara said automatically. "Just getting used to things." Delia sat across from her, studying her face. "Making any friends yet?" Amara shifted in her seat. "Not really. It's different here." "Different how?" Delia pressed gently. Amara pushed her food around the plate. Just, not as welcoming as our old neighborhood. Her mother reached across the table and took her hand. Give it time, baby. New places always feel strange at first. Remember how you cried your first day of martial arts class? Now look at you, trophies and all. The mention of martial arts made Amara think about Monday's challenge. In tournaments, there were rules, referees, and padded mats. Behind the school gym, there would be none of those things. Mom, Amara said slowly, if someone keeps bothering you, but you promised not to get into trouble, what should you do? Delia's expression turned serious. Is someone bothering you at school? Just hypothetically, Amara said quickly. Too quickly. Delia put down her fork. Amara Johnson, are you being bullied? Not exactly bullied, Amara hedged. Just, not welcomed. Because you're new? Amara looked down at her plate. Because I'm black. The kitchen fell silent except for the soft bubbling of the pot on the stove. Delia closed her eyes briefly, pain flashing across her face before she composed herself. We talked about this possibility when we decided to move, she said finally. Your father and I know it's not easy being one of the few black students in a mostly white school. It's okay, Mom. I can handle it, Amara assured her. I know you can, baby. But you shouldn't have to. Delia squeezed her hand. Do we need to talk to the principal? No. Amara said, perhaps too forcefully. I mean, it's not that bad. I'm figuring it out. Delia didn't look convinced. Your father taught you to stand your ground, and I taught you to use your words. But neither of us wants you fighting in school. I remember, Amara said. Self-defense is the last resort, not the first response. Exactly. Delia nodded. So what's your first response going to be? Amara thought for a moment. Avoidance? Her mother laughed. That's certainly one strategy. But don't forget, you have a voice too. Sometimes standing up for yourself means speaking truth to power. Later that evening, Amara sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, her eyes closed in meditation. The familiar ritual helped center her thoughts as she contemplated Monday's confrontation. Her phone buzzed with a text from her best friend from back home. How's the new school? Miss you. Red heart, Kira had written. Amara hesitated, then replied, different. Miss you too. Some jerks trying to start trouble. Kira's response was immediate, want me to come beat them up? Oncoming fist medium skin tone. Despite everything, Amara smiled. Kira had been her sparring partner for years, and they'd competed together in several tournaments. If anyone would understand her current dilemma, it was Kira. Might have to handle it myself, Amara typed. They don't know about my training. OMG. Secret identity moment. Like in the movies when they mess with the quiet kid who turns out to be a ninja. Martial arts uniform. Amara chuckled. Leave it to Kira to find the humor in the situation. But her next text was more serious. For real though, be careful. Don't let them push you into something you'll regret. That was the crux of the matter. Amara didn't want to fight, but she also wouldn't let herself be victimized. There had to be a middle path. Saturday morning, Amara woke early. Her father had returned late the night before and was still sleeping, but she could hear her mother moving around in the kitchen. Amara changed into workout clothes and went to the garage, which they had converted into a small training space. A punching bag hung in the corner, and exercise mats covered most of the floor. She began her usual warm-up routine, moving through stretches and basic forms with practiced ease. The familiar movements calmed her mind, allowing her to think more clearly about her situation. As she moved into more complex combinations, striking the heavy bag with precision, she heard the garage door open. Her father stood watching, still in his pajamas, a cup of coffee in hand. "Early morning session?" he asked, his voice gruff with sleep but warm with affection. "Just thinking," Amara replied, continuing her sequence. Thomas Johnson watched his daughter with pride. He had started her training as a way to build confidence and ensure her safety. Now, seeing the disciplined young woman before him, he knew it had given her much more than that. "Your mother mentioned you're having some trouble at school," he said, stepping fully into the garage and closing the door behind him. Amara stopped mid-strike and turned to face her father. "She shouldn't have told you. She's worried." "So am I." He set his coffee down and moved to hold the punching bag for her. "Want to tell me about it?" Amara resumed her strikes, putting more force behind them now. "Just some kids who think they own the school. They don't like newcomers, especially ones who look like me." Thomas's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "And what's your plan?" "They want to meet behind the gym on Monday." Amara delivered a particularly powerful kick to the bag. "To teach me where I belong." Her father absorbed the impact of the kick against the bag without flinching. "And where do you belong, Amara?" "Wherever I choose to be," she answered without hesitation. Thomas nodded, a smile touching his lips. "That's my girl." After a pause, he added, "What does your training tell you to do on Monday?" Amara stopped, wiping sweat from her brow. "Avoid the fight if possible." "But if not?" She trailed off. "If not?" her father prompted. "Protect myself, but with restraint," she finished. Thomas released the bag and placed both hands on his daughter's shoulders. "You've been training for 9 years not just to fight, but to know when fighting is necessary. I trust your judgment, Amara." His words gave her a new sense of confidence. As she continued her workout after he left, Amara began to formulate a plan for Monday morning. The Ridge runners thought they were laying a trap for her. They had no idea what was really waiting for them behind the gym. Sunday passed too quickly for Amara's liking. She spent the day helping her mother with chores, finishing homework, and trying not to think about what awaited her at school. But as evening fell and she packed her backpack for Monday, anxiety crept in like a shadow. That night, she barely slept. Her mind kept replaying different scenarios of what might happen behind the gym. By the time her alarm went off Monday morning, she had made her decision. She would go to the meeting place, but she would try one more approach before resorting to her training. "You're quiet this morning," her father noted as he drove her to school. Usually, she took the bus, but he had sensed her unease and offered a ride. "Just thinking about a test," she lied, staring out the window at the unfamiliar streets of their new town. As they pulled up to the school, Thomas reached over and squeezed her hand. "Remember who you are, Amara. You come from a long line of strong people who don't back down from what's right." She nodded, throat tight with emotion. "Thanks, Dad." The morning classes passed in a blur. Amara found it impossible to concentrate on lessons as the clock ticked closer to lunch period, the time Blake had specified for their meeting. When the lunch bell finally rang, Amara took her time gathering her things. She walked deliberately through the hallways, her heart pounding but her face composed. A few students glanced at her curiously, word having spread about the confrontation. Behind the gym was a small area hidden from the main yard by a row of dumpsters. As Amara rounded the corner, she found Blake and his friends already waiting. There were 6 of them now. They'd brought an extra person, probably expecting safety in numbers. "Look who actually showed up," Blake sneered as she approached. "Thought you might run to the principal." Amara stopped a few feet away from the group, her stance relaxed but alert. "I'm not here to fight," she said calmly. The group laughed. "That's good," Heather said, "'cause you wouldn't stand a chance." "I just want to understand," Amara continued, ignoring the taunt. What exactly is your problem with me? Blake stepped forward, clearly appointed as the spokesperson. You don't belong here. This school, this town, it has a certain tradition. You mean it's white, Amara said bluntly. The directness of her statement seemed to catch Blake off guard. I mean people like you change things. You don't fit in. I'm not trying to change anything, Amara replied. I'm just trying to get an education, like everyone else. Well, maybe we don't want you getting it here, another boy said, stepping up beside Blake. Amara noticed they had formed a loose circle around her. Classic intimidation tactic, surroundings your opponent to cut off escape routes. Her training recognized it immediately, even as her mind still sought a peaceful resolution. This is your last chance to walk away, Blake warned, his hand curling into a fist. Transfer to another school, or things are going to get very uncomfortable for you. Amara took a deep breath. She had tried words. She had tried reason. Now, as Blake took another step toward her, she knew what had to happen next. Time seemed to slow down as Blake lunged forward, swinging his fist toward Amara's face. In that instant, years of training took over. Amara pivoted smoothly to the side, Blake's fist missing her by inches. The momentum of his failed punch carried him forward, off balance. Before he could recover, Amara gently redirected his movement, using his own weight against him. Blake stumbled but didn't fall. What the, he sputtered, surprise replacing the confidence on his face. I don't want to fight, Amara repeated, returning to her neutral stance. But I will defend myself. Blake's face reddened with embarrassment and anger. He glanced at his friends, who looked equally shocked at Amara's quick movement. Get her, he ordered, and two boys rushed forward. What happened next left the entire group stunned. Amara moved with fluid precision, dodging the first attacker and blocking the second. She made no aggressive moves, only defensive maneuvers that left both boys confused and increasingly frustrated. She knows what she's doing, one of the girls whispered loudly, backing away slightly. Blake, unwilling to be humiliated, charged again. This time, Amara was forced to use a more decisive technique. She caught his arm, twisted slightly, and used a basic judo throw to send him sprawling onto the ground. The fall wasn't hard enough to injure, just enough to wind him and demonstrate her skill. Blake lay on his back, gasping for breath, staring up at the sky in disbelief. I've been training in martial arts since I was 7, Amara explained calmly, addressing the whole group. I'm a black belt. I compete in tournaments. And I really don't want to hurt any of you. A small crowd had gathered at the edge of the area, drawn by the commotion. Whispers rippled through the onlookers as they processed what they were seeing. One of Blake's friends helped him to his feet. His face was a mixture of anger and humiliation. This isn't over, he growled, though his voice lacked conviction. Actually, it is, came a firm voice from behind the crowd. Students parted to reveal Mrs. Rivera, the vice principal, standing with arms crossed. Her expression made it clear she understood exactly what was happening. My office. All of you. Now, she commanded. As they walked toward the main building, Amara heard the whispers following her. Did you see how she moved? She didn't even hit anyone. Blake got owned. Inside the vice principal's office, Mrs. Rivera looked at each student in turn. I want to know exactly what happened, and I want the truth. Blake spoke first, the lie ready on his lips. She attacked me for no reason. We were just talking, and she went crazy. Mrs. Rivera turned to Amara. Is that true, Ms. Johnson? Amara met her gaze steadily. No, ma'am. They surrounded me and threatened me. Blake swung first. I only defended myself. The vice principal's eyes narrowed. Anyone else want to share their version? To everyone's surprise, Heather stepped forward. Amara's telling the truth, she said quietly, avoiding Blake's outraged stare. This was all Blake's idea. He said we needed to put her in her place. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Mrs. Rivera's expression hardened as she looked at Blake. I see. And is there anyone else who would like to confirm this? A heavy silence filled the office. The Ridge runners exchanged nervous glances, their united front crumbling under Mrs. Rivera's stern gaze. Finally, another boy raised his hand slightly. Heather's right, he admitted. Blake told us we needed to scare her away because. He trailed off, suddenly aware of how it would sound. Because of what? Mrs. Rivera pressed. Because she's black, the boy finished, staring at the floor. Mrs. Rivera's expression remained firm, but sadness flickered in her eyes. I see. She turned to the rest of the group. Anyone else? Slowly, 3 more hands went up, confirming the story. Only Blake remained defiant, arms crossed and jaw set. Ms. Johnson, Mrs. Rivera addressed Amara. Several students witnessed what happened. They reported that you displayed remarkable restraint and skill. Is there anything you'd like to add? Amara thought carefully before speaking. I just want to attend school without being harassed. I tried talking first, but when that didn't work, I defended myself without causing harm. Mrs. Rivera nodded. I'll need statements from all of you. Then you can wait outside while I speak with Blake. As Amara and the others filed out, she noticed Blake's rigid posture, his eyes burning with anger and embarrassment. In the hallway, Heather approached her hesitantly. How did you learn to move like that? Years of practice, Amara replied simply. I've never seen anyone handle Blake that way. Heather seemed genuinely impressed. He's on the wrestling team. He usually wins. Fighting in a tournament is different from bullying, Amara said. One is sport. The other is wrong. Heather fidgeted with her bracelet. I'm sorry, she said quietly. For going along with it. For what we said about you. Before Amara could respond, the office door opened and Blake stormed out, face flushed with anger. He glared at his friends, especially Heather, before marching down the hallway. Mrs. Rivera appeared in the doorway. Ms. Johnson, a moment please. Inside the office, the vice principal motioned for Amara to sit. Blake has been suspended pending a disciplinary hearing. The others will receive detention and will be writing formal apologies. Amara nodded, relief washing over her. However, Mrs. Rivera continued, I'm concerned about your safety. Blake is troubled. His family has influence in this town, and his father tends to make excuses for his behavior. I can take care of myself, Amara assured her. I can see that, Mrs. Rivera smiled slightly. But you shouldn't have to. I've called your parents. They're on their way. Amara's stomach dropped. Am I in trouble? No. You defended yourself appropriately. But they need to know what's happening. As they waited, Mrs. Rivera studied Amara thoughtfully. You know, we have a self-defense club that meets after school on Wednesdays. They could use someone with your experience. Amara looked up, surprised. You want me to join? Actually, Mrs. Rivera said, I was thinking you might consider helping to teach it. Amara was still processing Mrs. Rivera's suggestion when her parents arrived. Her mother rushed in first, concern etched on her face, followed by her father, whose calm exterior barely contained his protective energy. Are you okay? Delia asked, scanning her daughter for injuries. I'm fine, Mom, Amara assured her. Really? Mrs. Rivera invited them to sit and explained what had happened. As the story unfolded, Amara watched her parents' reactions shift from worry to pride. You defended yourself without causing harm, her father said, nodding approvingly. Just as you were trained. The school does not tolerate bullying or racial harassment, Mrs. Rivera stated firmly. The students involved will face appropriate consequences. But I wanted to personally commend Amara for her remarkable restraint and skill. Thank you, Thomas said, placing a hand on Amara's shoulder. We've always taught her that her training comes with responsibility. Mrs. Rivera leaned forward. Actually, I was just telling Amara that our self-defense club could benefit from her expertise. With your permission, of course. Delia and Thomas exchanged glances. That would be her decision, Delia said. Later, as they drove home, Amara sat quietly in the back seat, watching the town pass by through the window. It looked different somehow, more like a place where she might belong. You did good, Amara, her father said, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. Standing up for yourself doesn't always mean throwing punches. I know, she replied. But I was ready if I needed to. Her mother turned in her seat. How do you feel about Mrs. Rivera's offer? Teaching self-defense to other students? Amara considered the question. I think I'd like that. Maybe I could help others learn to protect themselves. The next day at school, Amara noticed a change. Students who had never spoken to her before nodded in greeting. Some even approached with questions about her martial arts training. During lunch, she sat alone as usual, until a shadow fell across her table. She looked up to find Heather standing there, lunch tray in hand. Can I sit? Heather asked hesitantly. Amara nodded, surprised. Heather settled across from her, picking at her food nervously. Everyone's talking about what happened yesterday. Great, Amara sighed. No, it's good actually, Heather said quickly. People are impressed. Not just because you stood up to Blake, but how you did it. You could have hurt him, but you didn't. Amara shrugged. That's not what martial arts is about. Could you? Heather paused, seeming to gather courage. Could you teach me something sometime? Just basic self-defense? Before Amara could answer, two more girls approached the table. Is it true you're going to be teaching the self-defense club? One asked eagerly. News traveled fast in high school. I'm thinking about it, Amara replied. We want to join, the other girl said. After seeing how you handled those guys, well, a lot of us want to learn that. By the end of lunch, 5 girls had sat at Amara's table, each expressing interest in learning from her. As they talked, Amara began to see a path forward at Westridge, not just surviving, but making a difference. Wednesday afternoon arrived, and Amara stood nervously at the door of the school gym. Inside, nearly 20 students had gathered for the self-defense club, more than triple the usual attendance, according to Mrs. Rivera, who greeted her with a smile. They're all here for you, the vice principal said quietly. Word spreads fast. Amara took a deep breath and stepped forward. The room quieted as she walked to the center of the mats. Most faces were curious, some admiring, a few still cautious. Hi everyone, she began, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm Amara. I've been training in mixed martial arts for 9 years. Today, we're going to start with basic self-defense techniques. As she demonstrated the first moves, Amara felt her confidence growing. This was familiar territory, the stance, the forms, the focus. She paired students together, walking among them to adjust positions and offer guidance. Heather, to everyone's surprise, showed natural ability. You're a quick learner, Amara told her. I've been watching videos online since Monday, Heather admitted, somewhat embarrassed. By the end of the session, everyone was sweaty and smiling. Several students thanked Amara before leaving, and Mrs. Rivera looked pleased. Same time next week, she asked Amara. Definitely, Amara replied. As weeks passed, the club grew. Students from all grades joined, creating an unexpected community. Amara found herself at the center of a diverse group, united by a shared interest in self-defense and martial arts discipline. Blake remained suspended, but rumors circulated that his father was pressuring the school board to let him return. Amara tried not to worry about it, focusing instead on her classes and the growing success of the club. One afternoon, as she was demonstrating a defensive move, she noticed a figure watching from the doorway. It was Blake's father, Mr. Thompson, dressed in an expensive suit and wearing an expression Amara couldn't quite read. He disappeared before the session ended, but the next day, Amara was called to the principal's office. Her stomach tightened as she entered, especially when she saw Mr. Thompson sitting across from Principal Warner. "Amara, please sit down," the principal said. His tone was difficult to interpret. "Miss Johnson," Mr. Thompson began, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I wanted to meet you in person." Amara sat stiffly, waiting. "I watched your club yesterday," he continued. "You have remarkable skill for someone so young." "Thank you," Amara replied cautiously. Mr. Thompson sighed deeply. "I also want to apologize for my son's behavior. There's no excuse for what he did." Surprised, Amara glanced at Principal Warner, who nodded slightly. "Blake has been troubled since his mother died," Mr. Thompson explained. "But that doesn't justify his actions. I've been too busy building my business to notice how he was changing." He leaned forward, hands clasped. "I've enrolled Blake in counseling. He needs to understand that his behavior was unacceptable. And I want to make amends." Amara wasn't sure how to respond. This was not what she had expected. "The school's self-defense program has never had proper funding," Mr. Thompson continued. "I'd like to change that. New mats, equipment, whatever you need." Amara sat in stunned silence, processing Mr. Thompson's offer. Principal Warner seemed equally surprised. "That's very generous," Amara finally said, choosing her words carefully. "But I'm not sure I'm the right person to make that decision." Mr. Thompson nodded. "Of course. I'll work out the details with the school administration." He paused, then added, "There's one more thing. Blake will be returning to school next week. He's writing a formal apology to you, but I wanted to give you advance notice." After the meeting, Amara called her parents from the school office. Her father answered, and she quickly explained what had happened. "What do you think?" she asked. "About Mr. Thompson's offer and Blake coming back?" Her father was quiet for a moment. "People can surprise you, Amara. Sometimes in good ways. But be cautious, words and money are easier than real change." That evening, Amara shared the news with her mother while they prepared dinner. "You've started something important," Delia said, chopping vegetables beside her daughter. "Whatever Blake and his father do next, remember that you've already changed things at that school." The following week, Amara noticed the new equipment being delivered to the gym: professional-grade mats, training pads, and even protective gear. Mrs. Rivera couldn't stop smiling as she helped inventory everything. "This is a game-changer for our program," she told Amara. "We can accommodate twice as many students now." Word spread quickly about the upgraded equipment, bringing even more interest to the club. What had started as a small group had grown into one of the school's most popular activities. On Monday, Blake returned to school. Amara spotted him in the hallway, looking different somehow, less confident, more subdued. He kept his distance, but their eyes met briefly as they passed each other between classes. After school, as Amara was leaving, she found an envelope in her locker. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Amara," it began. "I know words aren't enough, but I'm sorry for what I did. My mom always taught me to be kind to everyone, and I've failed at that since she died. That's not an excuse. There is no excuse for how I treated you. What I said was wrong and hurtful. I'm working on myself with a counselor now. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to change. Blake." Amara folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. She wasn't sure how she felt about it yet. At Wednesday's club meeting, a surprise visitor appeared, Blake's friend Tyler, one of the boys who had surrounded her behind the gym. "Can I join?" he asked hesitantly, standing at the edge of the mat. The room fell silent, everyone looking to Amara for her response. She studied him for a moment, remembering her sensei's words, "The true test of martial arts is not who you can defeat, but who you can teach." "Everyone's welcome," she said finally. "But the first rule here is respect." Tyler nodded solemnly. "I understand." As the session began, Amara noticed a few students watching from the doorway. Among them was Blake, his expression a mixture of regret and curiosity. 2 months later, Westridge High School hosted its first self-defense exhibition. The gymnasium was packed with students, parents, and community members, all gathered to watch demonstrations from Amara's growing club. On the new mats emblazoned with the school logo, students performed the techniques they had learned. Amara led the demonstrations with confidence, her voice carrying across the gym as she explained each move and its purpose. In the front row sat her parents, beaming with pride. Beside them was Mrs. Rivera, who had become Amara's strongest advocate at school. Even Mr. Thompson attended, watching from the back of the room. "And now," Amara announced, "we'll demonstrate how to respond when confronted by multiple opponents." She nodded to her assistants, Heather and, surprisingly, Tyler, who had proven to be one of her most dedicated students. They circled her as she showed the crowd how to maintain awareness, create space, and defend without escalating the situation. After the exhibition, people crowded around to congratulate Amara. A local newspaper reporter asked for an interview, and the school board president mentioned expanding the program to other schools in the district. As the crowd thinned, Amara noticed Blake standing nearby. He had kept his distance these past weeks, respecting her space while working through his own issues. "That was impressive," he said quietly when she looked his way. "Everything you've built here." "Thanks," she replied. "Your dad's support made a lot of it possible." Blake nodded. "I've been watching the club. Learning a lot, even from the sidelines." "You could join," Amara offered, surprising herself. "If you're ready to respect everyone there." "Maybe someday," he said. "I'm still working on some things." Later, as her father helped pack up the equipment, he pulled Amara aside. "You know what I'm most proud of?" he asked. "Not your martial arts skills, though they're impressive. It's how you've used what you know to make positive change." Amara looked around the gym, at Heather chatting with her mother, at Tyler helping younger students put away gear, at the diverse group of students who had become a community. "When we moved here," she said, "I never imagined this would happen." Her father smiled. "Sometimes the greatest strength isn't in your fists, but in your ability to bring people together." As they walked out of the school together, Amara realized that what had started as a confrontation behind the gym had transformed into something much more powerful, a movement toward understanding, respect, and genuine change.